Well, hello everyone, and it's a huge privilege to be chairing this final session of this amazing conference. And this session, Responses to Modernity, the 20th and 21st centuries, and I've no doubt that although it is the last, it is definitely not the least. And I also want to take the opportunity to congratulate Mariam, not only on the conference which she's worked on with Leslie, but also on her wonderful exhibition at the V&A, Contemporary Ceramic Art from the Middle East. And I'm hoping that Mariam is going to put the link to in the chat to that. Western style studio pottery has long been an important part of the V&A collection, championed in great part by Oliver Watson, and it's so exciting to see works by Middle Eastern ceramic artists now being given their rightful place in the museum through the works that have been acquired by the V&A through Mariam's great work and that are also on loan. I hope that you'll have had a chance to see the wonderful presentations of our 5 speakers, and you'll see that they take us on particular journeys, each of which is set against and informed by the complexities of the history and politics of the Middle East during the 20th and 21st centuries, from Palestine to Iran. Sato Moualian introduces the work of her remarkable grandfather, Armenian potter David Ohanessian, with a focus on the child Quedeseka, if we're still allowed to call it Quedeseka now, the Iman, the niche in the Palestine Archaeological Museum. Jessica Gerscholt's presentation focuses on the remarkable project Objects of Imagination, which culminated in an exhibition in Amman in 2019-20, and she will also be taking us back in time to the work of key ceramicists from earlier decades in Iraq, Tunis and Lebanon. Gillian Eckling looks at the particular phenomenon of the contemporary ceramics biennales in Tehran and the way they have been promoted and why during the last 30 years. Elif Uras, whose beautiful pottery has been acquired by the V&A, speaks about the themes in her work. And finally, Charlotte Bank discusses the work of 2 fascinating artists who use the form of ceramic to make social and political commentary. So without further ado, we're going to have our quick summaries, and we're going to start with you, Sato. You need to unmute.
There we go. So thank you very much for the introduction. And I'd like to, before I begin, of course, thank the organizers of this amazing conference, Miriam and Leslie, as well as all the participants for the fascinating papers that I've been enjoying and learning from in these last days. I'm very, very grateful to be included and to give the first summary of this final session as we enter a later chronological period in which we extend some of the themes from the last session and also consider the agency, migration, traumas, and artistic preoccupations of individual ceramicists. My recorded presentation concerned the Ottoman Armenian ceramicist David Ohanessian of Kütahya, who survived forced exile from Kütahya to Aleppo in early 1916, and in 1919 founded Jerusalem's Armenian ceramics tradition under the aegis of the British Mandatory Administration of Palestine, as well as the cooperation of Jerusalem's Mufti. Ohanessian was my grandfather and the subject of my recent biography. Over the last decade, I researched his archival and material traces to better understand the circumstances of his migrations and to shed some light on Kütahya's ceramic production in the final decades of the Ottoman Empire. As well, I wanted to comprehend the struggles inherent with recreating an Anatolian-style ceramic practice in post-World War I Palestine. Despite scholarly attention to both Kütahya and Jerusalem ceramic schools and the general acknowledgement of the link between the two, the precise means of this artistic transfer had previously remained obscured. In his volume on Islamic ceramics, John Carswell emphasized that artists and craftspeople have often composed some of the imperial spoils of war. Conversely, I might add, individual artists and artisans have often also been displaced by war or mass violence, as was the case with Ohanessian. However, the breadth of his knowledge base, accrued over years of historic tile renovations and new architectural tile production under Mimar Kemalettin and the Young Turk regime, as well as Ohanessian's agency and the intersecting agendas of Palestine's British Mandatory Administration, Charles Ashby's Pro-Jerusalem Society, and local Palestinian actors, all of these provided conditions that allowed Ohanessian to adapt and reconstitute his ceramic art in Jerusalem, where the tradition continues to flourish today. In my video, I briefly discussed Ohanessian's introduction of some Ottoman architectural tile traditions to Jerusalem, and I highlighted one of his commissioned monumental tile works there, a fountain niche he designed and executed between 1931 and 34 for mandate architect Austin St. Barb Harrison's Palestine Archaeological Museum, which is known today as the Rockefeller Museum. Ohanessian described this work as his masterpiece. The 24-foot-high domed, four-sided structure decorated in, well, I'll say it, cuerda seca, or perhaps I should be saying black line or colorless line or barrier line tiles, as well as molded star and cross tiles in varied shades of cobalt, turquoise, light green, white, and black, might be called, in today's parlance, a work of hybrid modernity. These tiles were produced in Ohanessian's wood-fired kiln, a tradition he maintained in Jerusalem. Harrison's museum plans synthesized elements of the Beaux-Arts style in which he was trained, as well as components of the formal and vernacular architecture of the Eastern Mediterranean region he had studied in situ. Ohanessian's tile installation mirrored Harrison's synthetic or hybrid approach, a first for the ceramicist and a turning point after a long struggle to source appropriate clays and other minerals in Palestine. In the video, I also questioned whether Ohanessian's unusual tiled feature in the Rockefeller Museum might have referenced another ceramic installation in an older archaeological museum with which he was familiar. That is, the entryway of the Chinili kiosk of Topkapi Palace, which, beginning in 1880, housed a major Ottoman imperial collection of classical and archaeological objects. Finally, I noted that Ohanessian, as an Armenian Christian, was but one of many diverse cultural creators in Islamic lands, part of an Ottoman and post-Ottoman society that was, in Kate Franklin's words, non-monolithic. I look forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sato. Thank you. Well, what a remarkable story this is. So now we have Jessica and her paper, the summary, your 5 minutes, starting any minute now, on objects of imagination and its antecedents, revisiting modernist ceramics in the Arab world. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Venetia. Thank you, fellow panelists. I'd like to add my gratitude to Saitos and speak to you briefly about my presentation, which will represent part of a wider research project that I'm really just beginning. I was asked to look at the exhibition Objects of Imagination during the pandemic. So this has been quite an interesting and amazing opportunity for me, and I'm really excited to see more of the artworks. So basically my presentation first discusses the exhibition Objects of Imagination. It was a collaborative effort that was initiated by two artists, Delair Shakar and Dia Azawi. And this exhibition took place at the Jordan National Gallery of Fine Art in the winter of 2019-2020. And it contained the work of 35 artists who experimented with ceramic plate. And these 35 artists came from a number of different countries across the Arab world, many of whom had experience with all kinds of different media, but few had been trained as ceramicists. So this was a collaboration that was supported by the Kinda Foundation, and I'd like to acknowledge their role in bringing these artists together. And then when artists arrived in small groups, they took short residencies together. Artists were about 4 or 5 in number, and they worked with Delair Shakar and the ceramicist Walid Qaisi to learn techniques and different approaches to the ceramic plate, and that was sort of the unifying factor. Each artist created a series of 4 plates, And this was done in the spirit of homage as well to the artist Saad Shakr. Saad Shakr was the father of Daler Shakr, and he was also a foundational member of the Baghdad Academy of Fine Arts. And he was somebody who experimented and turned to pottery during a period in which in 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, there was a great focus on painting and sculpture. And certainly he made ceramic sculptures, but he advocated for ceramics as a medium in its own right. So kind of studying and working with this material, and again, I'd like to say this, you know, was interesting to try to do research during a pandemic, and working with Dia and working with Louisa Macmillan. It really got me thinking about previous material that I had encountered in my own research on modernist ceramics. So some of my own work focuses on the so-called decorative arts, particularly in Tunisia. I've also started working in Lebanon, and I'm often working with textiles and tapestry. But ceramics generally can be often paired with tapestry and textiles, particularly in the early modern period and during the colonial period, as sort of a craft-based medium. And I'm interested in sort of colonial hierarchies of the arts. So I started to think about some of the practices of key modernists and their work to sort of uplift the status of artisans and craft-based media. And I identified a few in the presentation, Abdelaziz Gorgi and Ali Balagha from Tunis. Like Saad Shakr, Abdelaziz Gorgi was a founding member of the École de Beaux-Arts ceramics studio. And then I looked at Salwa Shuair's engagement with ceramics when she was a designer for the Point 4 agency in Lebanon. And then I kind of wrapped up with the practices of Tariq to China, and gained great inspiration there. And so I began to think about the plate as an object of imagination, as well as other vessels, and the ways in which modernist artists really sought to revive and reimagine practices in modernist settings. So kind of reconsidering artistic lineages, I thought was quite apt for the ways in which these artists all came together for the final project of Objects of Imagination. And so, you know, I sort of wrap up with a call to rethink ceramic histories, particularly in the 1950s and 60s, where definitely more research on this period is needed. So that's a brief summary, and I'm also looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jessica. Incredibly wide-ranging paper. And now let's turn to Gillian Eklund and her paper, Iranian Biannual Exhibitions of Contemporary Ceramics, 1988 to 2011. Thank you, Gillian. Over to you. You're muted, by the way.
Yeah, got it. Thank you. Okay, brilliant. So my paper gave a brief overview of a series of national ceramics exhibitions that were held in Iran from 1988 to 2020. And these exhibitions have been largely overlooked in contemporary Iranian art histories, even to the point of literally being a footnote in sort of larger descriptions of painters and photographers. However, I would argue that these exhibitions offer not only a really interesting counterpoint to those dominant narratives, but also were a key foundation for the sort of diverse and exciting practice happening in the country today. And the real achievement of the biennials is in offering a platform for the ideological growth of ceramics. And by reframing established processes as a visual art, the biennial artists really pushed Iranian ceramics heritage to take on additional layers of aesthetic and conceptual inspiration. With these exhibition submissions were more diverse and the number of contributors and venues went up. Participation in the biennials would eventually grow to include more than 500 people and provide the foundation for the establishment of an independent professional association for ceramic artists. The biennial exhibitions were originally begun by a small handful of artists in Tehran, and within just a few years, the organizers managed to secure significant public and government support. Ceramics as an art form was enthusiastically endorsed by the cultural leaders of the Islamic Republic, who attempted to reclaim the medium as an alternative to foreign models of modern art embraced by the Pahlavi state. It also fit into this wider narrative promoting the arts as a kind of natural expression of a uniquely Islamic Iranian national identity. And at the same time, we can see technical developments throughout the progression of the exhibitions demonstrate artistic engagement with wider international ideas. For example, in the early biennials, we can see the predominant vernacular influence of the studio pottery movement and the influence of modernist sculpture. In the later biennials, there's a very postmodern concern with conceptual content and with meta narratives in the materials. So taken as a group, the collective body of the biennial artworks mirrors the cultural and socio-political conditions of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, especially as domestic ceramics begin to move out of rural production workshops and into the homes of an educated urban population. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Look forward to a discussion about that later. So now it's over to you, Elif, talking about your own work, Reinventing Tradition, Iznik Pottery and Shifting Notions of Gender and Class. Thank you so much.
Hi. Thank you, Venetia, for moderating this panel, and thank you to all my fellow panelists. And I'd also like to extend my gratitude to Mariam and Leslie for organizing this amazing conference and inviting me to participate. I was born in Ankara, Turkey, and I live and work between New York and Istanbul. I make paintings and ceramics that explore ideas of gender and class. I'm interested in representations of women across different geographies and time. And I'm also interested in ways in which capitalist economy and mass culture construct a sense of visual identity and how the local and the global intersect to create forms of production and consumption. I started my career as a painter and I eventually gravitated to ceramics after I went to Iznik in 2007. As you all know, the Iznik ceramic tradition produced some of the most lustrous and richly colored ceramics during the period between 15th and 17th centuries, which decorate the major monuments of the Ottoman Empire and can be found in the many museums around the world. The tradition died in 17th century and was reincarnated in the 20th. It's an interesting example of local ceramic production intersecting with global forces, the Silk Road, and the trade routes of raw materials. When I went to Iznik, I initially wanted to paint on plates and vases because of their domestic and feminine associations, and also to exhibit them alongside my paintings in order to challenge the hierarchies around fine art and ceramics and craft. Soon I realized this would not be enough. The tradition and the historic connections were so complex, and the medium of ceramics was so attractive that I kept going back, researching and learning all about the history, the technique, and the medium of clay. Today in Iznik, there are numerous ceramic studios, even factories, which mostly work in the traditional style, copying the greatest masterpieces of the Ottoman era. I wanted to see if I could recontextualize this tradition and make work that responds to our contemporary time and society. In my talk, I discussed how my ceramic works relate to this tradition stylistically. I also explored how they serve as a commentary on the shifting notions of gender and class in relationship to ideas of production and consumption. In contemporary Iznik, women dominate the workforce as entrepreneurs as well as craftspeople and artists. This represents a gender reversal from 16th century Iznik, which reflected the patriarchal structure of the time, where all the artists and craftspeople were men. So in my ceramic works, I wanted to bring the female figure into the tradition to emphasize what has been missing from its earlier incarnation. The imagery and narratives in the work began to shape around the idea of feminized labor, inspired by the narratives of women I saw around me in pottery studios, and also the women I saw working in the fruit orchards and olive groves around town. Another dimension I've sought to express in my ceramic work is the socioeconomic implications of Iznik's contemporary rebirth as a ceramic center. Historically, Iznik was seen in the purview of the elite. In the case of tiles, commissioned by the Ottoman aristocracy, who were the patrons of the architectural monuments erected in their name, or in the case of ceramic wares as a more practical and affordable alternative to Chinese porcelain wares, which were the objects of conspicuous consumption by the elite at the time. Today, with the proliferation of ceramic production all over town, traditional Iznik pottery has become more accessible. The women who work in the studios make pottery for their own and each other's dowries. Iznik pottery has become synonymous with objects of mass consumption. Also, by providing employment to local women, it has given them agency away from home. In my work, I seek to document the idea of feminized labor in a traditional yet modernizing society where women are wage earners as well as domestic laborers tasked with the unpaid housework and caregiving. By focusing on labor, I want to portray women as symbols not only of a transition between tradition and modernity, but of capitalist production and consumption. As I illustrate in my talk through visual imagery, I use ornamentation, figuration, and abstraction, art and craft in tandem to incorporate forms, motifs, and patterns from a variety of historic references and recontextualize them to forge my own narrative frameworks about gender in contemporary society. That's my summary, and I'm also looking forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really, really fascinating, and looking forward again, as with everyone, to our further discussions. And then finally, Charlotte Bank is going to speak to us on the great topic of subversive porcelain, social and political commentary in the works of contemporary artists from the Middle East. Thank you. Over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Venetia, for the introduction. And I'd like to join the choir of saying thanks to the organizers, Mariam and Leslie. It has been a fascinating conference, and thanks so much for this work you've done. So in my paper, I discussed the works of two contemporary artists who, by using porcelain, offer critique of specific contemporary social and political issues. One of the works I discuss is the Lebanese artist Raad Yassin's series China from 2012, a series of large vases in blue and white porcelain, two of which are part of the collection of the British Museum and are currently on show in the exhibition Contemporary Ceramic Art from the Middle East at the V&A. On first sight, these vases are just elegant decorative items, as you might find them in elite homes around the world, in Europe and also in Lebanon. But if you look closer, you see that the depictions represent scenes of war and include modern weaponry. Each of the vases depict a particular scene or battle of the Lebanese Civil War, chosen by the artist for their significance as one of the battles that were what he called that changed the demographic of the Civil War. So he produced a series of drawings for which he drew on classical Islamic painting techniques to produce these depictions of the battles. And then he commissioned the vases from a porcelain production company in Jingdezhen in China, a traditional production site of porcelain that also played an important role in the export of porcelain from China to the rest of the world and also to the Middle East. He then commissioned a number of Chinese porcelain painters to produce their own versions of his own drawings and decorate the vases with these images. As the artist himself has stated, by putting images of the Civil War, in a way by putting the war itself on a breakable, mass-produced object, he wanted to get rid of its power that still continues to haunt Lebanese society. He wanted to create a series of objects that allowed the Lebanese to throw away the war, so to speak. As I argue in my paper, this allows us to see the vases in the context of art that deals with trauma. This is a vast issue and, of course, very difficult to sum up in a few sentences or in a paper even. And for artists working in this context, and especially when the artist seeks to produce emancipatory work, there's always the question of how to represent trauma in a way that allow witnesses and survivors to come to terms with these traumas and overcome their stifling effects. The second work I discuss is No Language from 2017 by the Afghani artist Jano Gausi. It's an installation of an elegantly set table, dinner table, with porcelain dishes that the artist had manufactured especially for the project. A sentence in Farsi is written on the plates that translates, "You do not need any language to wash dishes." This sentence refers to a conversation that the artist overheard on a plane to Kabul between two men who discussed their experiences of living as migrants in Sweden and Germany, respectively, one as a legal refugee in Germany and the other as an illegal worker in Sweden. The man living in Germany asked his seat neighbor how he had managed to live so many years in Sweden without knowing the language, and got as an answer the sentence written on the dishes. The installation serves as a reminder of the hidden labor that guarantees the comfort and luxury of life in the West, and how it depends on people who are not heard or seen. These are people who experience extreme insecurity, a situation that is often referred to as hyper-precarity, which includes dependency on contingent work and unfree labor, short-lived employment contracts, and often exploitative, degrading, dangerous, and harsh working conditions, but also beyond that, a lack of security when it comes to adequate housing and welfare, and a very precarious legal status in general. This is also reflected in the table, which is set for 6 people. It's a very closed environment. In these 2 works, the medium of porcelain adds a particular dimension to the works. It's a product that has been highly desired throughout its history, seen as elegant and belonging to refined elite taste. As such, it has traveled easily, and this stands in contrast to large numbers of the world's population. In Raad Yassin's work, the elegant vases reminds of the interiors of elite homes in Lebanon, yet their images reminds us of those events and memories, together with their underlying socio-political issues, that Lebanese political elites have failed to address since the end of the civil war. In Jano Gausi's work, the refined porcelain dishes serve as a reminder of the contrast by which luxury goods travel as opposed to unwanted migrants. As I concluded my paper, the porcelain objects in both works represent a border between a vulnerable or traumatic reality on the one hand, and the refinements of a society who attempts to ignore this reality on the other. So it reminds us as viewers of histories, whether personal or collective, that continue to haunt us and continue to pop up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charlotte, for that, and to all of you for amazingly encapsulating all of this incredible research and work that you have done into those 5 minutes. You're each tackling such important and complex topics, and they raise so many issues that I hope we're going to discuss. You know, first of all, around craft versus art, and that contemporary ceramics also live alongside contemporary art, with many artists working across several media. So I thought that what we could do first of all is that I wanted to ask each of you a question, and then we'll have some general discussion between us before turning it over to the audience at 4:30. So Satu, first of all, if I could come to you. I mean, this is a completely remarkable thing that you have done, really bringing to light the life of what is, you know, not only he's your grandfather, but somebody really quite remarkable, a brilliant potter, and one who's been largely written out of the record. I mean, I had a quick look at, you know, my classic Arthur Lane, thinking I might see something there, but of course there was nothing there at all. But I haven't examined, you know, ceramics books, but in detail, looking for that particular thing, but it sounded to me very much by the way you were talking about that he has been sort of really quite marginalized. And what's so fascinating is that his life is just completely bound up with the later history of the Ottoman Empire and indeed of Palestine as well. And so I was wondering about this, first of all, this kind of this fact that he hasn't been mentioned. I remember you said in I think it must have been in your paper that in the kind of credits for the niche that there was a potter called that gave his name, but otherwise it just didn't say anything at all. So could you say just a little bit more about why do you think he has been marginalized in that way?
Thank you very much. That's a really excellent and perceptive question. And I think there are sort of two strands to this. The one is that, most of the people who have written about both, Kütahya ceramics and Jerusalem ceramics have been either Turkish historians or British or Israeli historians who each tended to consider the art as an entity unto itself, Kütahya ceramics or Jerusalem ceramics. And of course, the thread between these two schools of ceramic making was Ohanessian's arrest and deportation during the Armenian genocide, which is, was only recognized very recently by the American government and introduces, let's say, problematic material into the sort of historiography of all of this. And then there's the issue that, he arrived in Jerusalem as a destitute immigrant. And he was working with Oxbridge-educated men who had read classics and, prided themselves on their interest and knowledge of archaeology. And so socially, he had a different status, although that ignores the body of knowledge that he had accrued, for his career. So I wanted to set the record, I wanted to sort of reintroduce him into the literature and also connect these two schools of ceramic making more clearly. So I'm hoping that going forward, his role and also the role of other local Palestinian craftsmen will be written back into the record.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's so interesting. But also, you mentioned that a lot of the documents that he had, were destroyed, but that you had managed to rescue some of them. And I was very struck in your presentation by those notes, which were the recipes of his glazes and so on. So could you say something about the archive that you have and what actually it encompasses?
My great advantage is that my grandfather had 7 children, and each of those children, or almost all of them, had children of their own. So I have 14 cousins and a brother, and wow. So collectively, we discovered that we had an actual archive. When I started the process, I started with a literature review, so I found every mention of the subjects that I was talking about. But then during that time, I was also urging my cousins to search their attics and basements and all of that. And what manifested were detailed recipes for the production. I found that he separated, for example, exact recipes for a color from recipes for, how long something should be fired or under what conditions, how many times, so that I think if any of these elements were discovered, it would still not be possible to reproduce his secrets, but by pooling our resources in my family, we were able to kind of reconstruct a narrative of his life and his work.
Yeah, that's such a great project, and also something that clearly has brought the family together in this amazing way. Thank you so much.
It does. May I just add one thing? There were actually a surprising number of documents in the Ottoman archives. I mean, there were documents that were in front of our eyes, but had not been examined by art historians. So I think it just fell to a member of his family to do this work.
Yeah. Well, lucky him. that you did this fantastic work. Jessica, I'd like to come to you. This is an extraordinary work that you have done here, and I love the way that you started with this exhibition. These 35 artists from across the Middle East. Very few of them had ever made pottery before, and this idea to focus on the plate. Now, I know you said that it was something that the Kinder Foundation supported, and that was just so great. I'd like to know who was the person who just came up with the idea. Was it that over a cup of tea or a glass of wine somewhere somebody said, let's do this? How did it happen? It's such an extraordinary idea.
Great. Well, thank you for your question. So what I would say is that Daler Shakir, who'd founded the Enki Ceramic Studio in Amman just the year before in 2017, was with Dia Azawi, and there was a number of plates that had done together, and a member of the Kinda Foundation became very interested in this work. And so they conceived together of a collaboration that would bring many artists together to experiment with ceramics. And Dia, of course, has a long history of working with a number of artists in Iraq and the diaspora. And so sort of this, I believe, sort of represents a continuation of his supportive work for artists, and in particular in ceramics. In the longer research project that I'm doing, I'm kind of looking at some of his work as artistic director of the Iraqi Cultural Center in London. So he had been supporting the work of ceramics students and artists in Baghdad since the 1970s, and notably helping to stage 2 exhibits in 78 and in 79 in Iraq. And they also traveled to Damascus and to Caracas, bringing the work of a number of artists together. Which is really incredible, and he's continuing to do this work, and Objects of Imagination hopefully will be on exhibit in the future. That is the plan. There's a catalog in preparation, but it's of course the conditions right now have just made everything a little bit more challenging. Daler Shakir certainly has been an incredible source of support for all of these artists, and gave everybody suggestions that they could work with so they could develop their practices and experiment in different ways that, made sense to them.
I think it's so
I'm just,
sorry.
Yeah, please go ahead.
No, I mean, so I'm just endlessly fascinated by and just amazed by Dia Azawi, in that he's not only just such a brilliant artist, but that also he has always encouraged other Iraqi artists, not just Iraqi artists, but you just think of the artist books. They all started to make after sanctions, and these Defata and so on. So it's no surprise that actually a number of the artists in this amazing collaboration are also making artist books. So that's very interesting, the way these artists are kind of crossing media. I wanted to ask you actually about, there's so much to ask you about, but I have to limit myself here. But I'm very interested in the work that you've done on the École de Tunis, and what you talked about Ali Balagha, and this amazing research you've done on him and Gorgi. And it's actually a question going back to archives, that I noticed that in your presentation you referenced the private collection of Ali Balagha, but I just wondered to what extent there were these archives that you could actually use for your research, because this is very, very important when these artists have archives for all of us for the future.
Oh yes, absolutely. I'd like to echo Seto and just saying that the artists' families are really key. And in terms of Ali Balagha, not only did he have a family that was willing and supportive of sharing their works, but the artist himself had really saved and meticulously documented his work. So I would say I met his nephew, Dr. Karim Balagha, who then, this was a few years, 5 or 6 years ago, who invited me to his house, and I worked on the dining room table with all of the meticulously organized press clippings that Balagha had kept. as well as photographs, books, receipts. I mean, the material was extensive. I've also worked with the family of Abdelaziz Gorgi, and they were likewise very generous in sharing with me different materials. But I would say that the Ali Belagha archives were in particularly very, very impressive. And to my knowledge, these were materials that, hadn't really been made accessible yet to many art historians or to the public. In Tunisia, it's always a challenge because there is no kind of centralized archive. And so it really does develop, or it does matter to develop relationships with artists and their families. I'd say with Belagha too, his life partner, Jacqueline Gilbert Belagha, had also kept a number of materials related to their gallery that they ran for 10 years in Tunis. And Ali Belagha situated his ceramic practice as part of this gallery that sought to uplift the artisanal community in Tunisia during a period in which craft guilds and artisans faced a number of challenges. So,
yeah, that's so interesting. I had just a final question actually for you, which is also for Gillian, because across two completely different ceramic traditions, in different practices, say in Iraq and then in Iran. And one of the things that you talked about, Jessica, was that when you talked about the Iraqi artists of the earlier generation, and that the reason why they loved to work with ceramics was it kind of took them back, to clay and to earth and kind of authenticity. And this was something that Gillian, you spoke about actually in terms of how that was one of the reasons why it was so possible for these ceramic biennales to happen. This wasn't kind of complex, political art. This was pottery. But I just wondered, Jessica, whether you could just give a quick comment on that notion that they felt, these artists, they were kind of going to this kind of authentic material.
Well, yes, absolutely. And this is such a huge topic, but very, very briefly, in Iraq, there were references made to sort of the beginning of pottery, the origins of the art form, being in the land and in the soil along the riverbeds of the Euphrates. Enki Ceramic Studio is named after the Mesopotamian deity for craft work and creation. And so a number of artists, drew direct link both to the land itself as well as the sort of cosmology and religions, as well as the long histories of Islamic ceramics that traverse the earth. And so whether we're talking about sort of nationalism or the experience of nostalgia from being in exile, the actual material, the matter of the soil from which the clay comes from takes on, a very deeply symbolic resonance.
And so, do you think for you, Gillian, in the work that you did with the Iranian artists, so that's the same idea, isn't it? That these Iranian artists were being supported because it was felt that they were creating like authentic, in inverted commas, Islamic art. Was it? Could you say a little bit more about that? It's so fascinating, and the parallels between the two.
Yeah, sure. So I think, as I was watching Jessica's paper, I was just sort of jumping all over the place with excitement to see these kind of parallels that, were really the sort of international resonances that go all the way back to the kind of introduction of mid-century. And I think to sort of briefly touch on that, this idea that, that there's communication not only between countries, but this kind of shared narrative of international experience that sort of forms around ceramics. And I think that's one of the kind of unique traits of ceramics as an art form, is this idea that a lot of producers have, that ceramics is kind of a universal, expressive material, in that it goes, through all of human history and all different societies, and that even as contemporary makers, we can draw lessons from the sort of authenticity of it, no matter where we're approaching it from. But as far as the sort of the metaphors of clay in the Islamic Republic, there are two pieces to that. And the first really that I didn't have time to address in my paper is that during the Pahlavi administration prior to the Islamic Revolution, there really was this emphasis on ceramics as reframing it as a nationalist symbol. And so what happens after the Industrial Revolution, when ceramics is no longer, a sort of necessary functional production, it kind of frees it up to take on these sort of additional ideological layers. And the Pahlavi administration really emphasizes it as a national sort of art form. But what we see is that their definitions draw very much from, and this is sort of addresses a question that you'd asked a little bit earlier, their definition really draws on the sort of European models of the division between fine art and craft, and so I think that's one of the things that's really interesting. Where in Iraq and the sort of places that Jessica is describing, it happens a little bit earlier. In Iran, there is sort of this international modernist movement, but it's really, it's limited. And I think part of that is because the Pahlavi state is very interested in kind of maintaining control over the narrative of what is modern art and what is not. And so most of the exhibitions that happen in the 1970s in Iran that concern ceramics really frame it as craft with a capital C, and sort of very limited experimentation into the kind of sculptural aspects or possibilities. And it's not
except sorry to just to cut in there. I mean, except that artists like Parviz Tanavuli, who he got the first kiln into the thanks to Abbey Gray, and had it installed in the university, and he and Zendarudi, and you showed actually a plate of Zendarudi's there. I mean, so they were making very kind of what you might call modernist ceramics, and these were being exhibited, as far as I know, in their exhibitions and in the Biennale. So at that early stage, there didn't seem to be such a kind of distinction between what you made in ceramics or bronze or painting or whatever. But I was interested in how with these ceramic biennales, they are just uniquely ceramic, and why that is. It's very, very strange, year after year, just ceramic. It's right.
And I think that the really important distinction to make there is that the sort of Sakahane and Tanavoli and those artists are really experimenting with ceramics in a different kind of way than what happens in the biennials. So the sort of modernist sculptural pieces that we see tend to not be drawing on the kind of historic ceramics idiom, but rather they're applying the characteristics and the kind of motifs of modern art to this material, rather than the other way around. And I think it is quite limited. But I think, and that's why it never really takes off until the sort of in the post-revolutionary period, where what you get is this kind of embracing of the metaphors of clay, particularly in constructing this Iranian Islamic identity. So ceramics is an authentic nationalist art medium that can be embraced by a regime that really wants to sort of make a point about their ability to contribute to modern art, and that it's an acceptable kind of there's a lot of that kind of dealing with the sort of religious metaphors of clay and the kind of universality of it.
Yeah, it's completely fascinating. Thank you. I'm going to move on to Elif. And it's such a privilege, I think, always to hear artists talking about their work. And the question I had to ask you was really around materials and techniques. Look at these beautiful works that you make, and these kind of undulating figures, and they're utterly beautiful. So I wanted to ask you about these beautiful scenes that you draw, often which include ceramics or women making things, including ceramics. I mean, do you first of all, in terms of like the preparation, do you sketch them out first? Do you have notebooks full of these sketches, and then do you make the pottery yourself, and do you use the wheel, or what? Tell us about your process a bit.
Yeah, I mean, my process is twofold. I mean, on one hand, I create my own forms, and on the other hand, I come out with, imagery to draw on them. So, in Islamic tradition, as you know, is slip casting, which is essentially pouring wet clay into molds. So I first come up with ideas regarding sculptural forms inspired by classical, Chinese or Islamic forms, or even prehistoric forms. And then I work with a sculptor friend to make 3D models of these forms. And then we make plaster molds of these models. So it's a long, winded process. And then I have used the same molds to create vessels, but each one is uniquely painted and drawn on, and they're all drawn, by my hand. So even when I use similar patterns, there's always a deviation in motif or color. And my process, like I do sketch on them, like I use the surface of the clay as paper or canvas. So that's how my process diverges from the tradition, because in terms of drawing and painting, I don't use stencils or perforated cartoons that they use in the traditional way. They use make holes in cartoons and put them over the surface and press them with charcoal dust to transfer the image, which is sort of mechanical. And I don't do that. I just, go in directly with pencil, so that, it's also very important to me that my hand is in there. And then after, when I'm, satisfied and, have refined the drawing over and over again, I go in with, the sort of the heavy ink-like paint, which is called contour paint in Islamic, which they developed to draw the outlines of images, so that under the glaze, underglazed paints wouldn't run into each other. And I just, basically use that primarily as sort of as a watercolor or gouache or ink, and in blue or white and in black and white.
And so, thank you. That's so interesting. But in terms of your designs, so I've noticed that a lot that it seems to be your preferred design is the one which is inspired by the spiral designs of the that are in the tugras, which is sometimes also called golden horn. And I just wondered what was it about that particular motif of all of the wide range of Islamic that you could choose? Why is it that has actually just drawn you so much?
Yeah, I have used that most often, and I use, I emphasize that in my talk because it's also, featured in two of my works that is in Mariam's display in the Victoria and Albert. They're both, have similar patterns, which are based on this golden horn pattern that you talked about. I mean, for those who don't know, the pattern features tiny rosettes and leaves that are rendered in tightly coiled vines, and it is derived from calligraphy. It has the look of calligraphy, and in particular the turas, or the royal monograms of the sultans. I like the pattern because it feels very delicate and feminine to me, yet it's associated with the ultimate signifier of patriarchal power. So I wanted to somehow subvert that by applying it to the surface of these really feminine vessels, particularly the ones resembling the pregnant body. And also the fact that it's like in spirals or coils is interesting to me. And I've also been researching pottery motifs from prehistory in the Anatolian region. And since all the basic patterns of abstraction emerged, it's supposed to be a symbol of life force energy. So to associate it with the pregnant body felt very appropriate.
Yeah, that's so. There's such beautiful works. I hope we can come back to them shortly. But Charlotte, let me come to you now. I'm so fascinated by this notion that the two artists that you've chosen to talk about, so interestingly, that both of them they're not potters. They are multimedia artists, or both of them. I mean, some of you may have heard Raed Yassin's completely, well, for me, quite impenetrable music. I mean, quite extraordinary. He works in so many different media, and Gaussi is, she's an installation artist. She makes videos and all sorts of extraordinary things. So I'm very interested in this idea that both of them are using the medium of ceramic as a vehicle for what they actually want to do. And I just wondered if you knew why they both chose that as a vehicle.
Yeah, thank you. It's a good and interesting point, because I don't think, I mean, they're both artists that work very, very conceptually, and I think for both of them, they wanted to address a particular issue, and the porcelain came in later. So probably through, as far as I understand, it's more through a process of research and thinking about how to best address these issues. And for both of the artists, the elite aspect of porcelain was very important. For Raed Yassin, it was this. The porcelain represented these elegant, decorative items that stand around in elite homes, and he wanted to use the porcelain medium to subvert that and put these gruesome images on this refined medium to address this never-ending trauma of the Lebanese civil war. And open up an opportunity, a possibility to destroy them, to make them breakable, to make the war and the memories and the trauma breakable. And for Janu Gaussi, the idea, the porcelain represents also this elite environment of refined dinner settings that are very close, they're very isolated, they're exclusive. You cannot access them unless you're invited to the table. And so for her, the porcelain also had this this elite aspect. But it is interesting that it's something that came through the artist's research and didn't stand at the beginning of the process.
Yeah,
yes,
I mean, that's so interesting, and also that for Raed, and I'm struck by how so many Lebanese artists, whether some of them were just barely children when certainly at the start of the Lebanese Civil War, so 15 years, 1975 to 1990, and people talk about how that war actually has never really come to an end, and all these terrible things that have been happening to Lebanon these last years, and the economy, and then the blast, and so on. And it's so interesting how Raed is part of a group of artists who are sort of examining the Lebanese Civil War. They talk about how their kind of parents' generation didn't want to talk about it, and so they are the ones who are kind of bringing it to the fore and continually talking about it. And in this way, you say very eloquently, that it's as though they wanted to kind of throw that away. I don't know if you have any comments about that, or if anybody else has any comments about this particular issue. But Charlotte, what are your thoughts about this too?
Well, I think first of all, anybody living in Lebanon at the moment or during the past decades have been faced with the civil war actually on a daily basis, because so much that has to do with the dysfunctionality of the Lebanese state has to do with the Civil War. I mean, warlords, those people who were responsible for terrible massacres during the Civil War, are still in power, and as long as they are in power, the system that kept the war going on and on and on somehow remains in power. And I think these younger, now they're not even, you can't even say they're young artists anymore, because they're not that young anymore. But their sort of rebellion against this state and against this hesitation to address the issues, I think it's something actually I think you can observe in other locations that have witnessed war. I think we might say something similar also about Germany after the Second World War, that the parent generation, that those who were adults during the war and who took part in the war, their children were the ones to address the issues, especially in filmmaking, for instance. So I think it has to do with this reluctance just to accept that there is this idea, or it is actually, I mean, that it's often said that there is this state-imposed amnesia in Lebanon, and of course it doesn't mean that people don't remember anymore, but that there is this idea that we have to put a lid on what happened and we're not going to talk about it. And this generation to which Raad belongs is saying that no, we don't want to deny it. We want to address it. We want to keep on bringing it up, and also in this rebellious way, but also really in a spirit that they want to break it. They want to break the power of these traumas, to hopefully reach a point where they don't have this stifling grip on society.
Yeah, no, it's no, thank you. Yeah, it's also interesting and sad, very poignant, all of it too. I'm going to take a few questions from the audience that I've seen popping up. One is for you, Elif. This is from Jennifer Scarce, who's actually interested in the products of these kind of folk, in inverted commas, products of Çanakkale. I too actually have always been fascinated by Çanakkale, and they're always, you know, the pots that get put at the back of the cupboard. You know, they're not ones that normally get put out on display. In our Al-Bukhari gallery, I was very pleased to be able to put some Çanakkale pieces alongside the Iznik. And could you make some comments about Çanakkale, and are these traditions still carrying on as well?
Yes, I actually just like a few days ago saw an amazing example of what you're referring to as the folk products of Çanakkale. It was so loose, and the colors were so unusual. It almost looked very contemporary, and you know, there was a weird dragon head coming from multiple like wing-like forms, and you know, it was just this object, and it was so different from everything I've seen in terms of like the traditional stuff that I was really amazed. And I haven't researched this area very much, but I do really want to, you know, get into it while I can, and you know. And what the other question she was asking about was, you know, the revival in Iznik, I think, if I read it correctly.
Yeah.
And they are, you know, it is, I mean, when I went to Iznik, I started like, you know, researching this in the Iznik Foundation, and I know a bit about their history, and they started in 1995 and, you know, did a huge collaboration with multiple, you know, universities and research institutions in the US and Turkey to, you know, come out, you know, adopt these traditional recipes to, you know, modern technology, and, you know, the wood firing techniques to the modern electric kilns. And, you know, now they make all their, you know, paints from local resources, and they do use traditional, you know, methods, in the sense that, you know, they, as I mentioned, they, you know, press the patterns onto the surface using, you know, this charcoal, and they, you know, they do use traditional motifs that they adopted that we see in the Ottoman, the most well-known masterpieces of the Ottoman times with the carnations and the rumis and the roses and the trees of life. So this is basically still produced in contemporary Iznik by
but sorry to cut in, but I mean you're one of the very few who is actually kind of innovating, who's using the tradition but creating new forms and subjects. I mean the others, I mean they're completely amazing, and often you can't really, on first sight you can't distinguish them from so they're just continuing. It's the same designs, isn't it? It's trying to kind of echo the perfection of those Iznik wares, isn't it? It's
yes. So it's a little bit like also like politically sensitive, because the current government is trying to emphasize like neo-Ottoman, trying to revive these traditional arts and like trying to in the traditional style, and I'm more interested. And from childhood, I've seen examples of this, and there's really beautiful examples that like look just like the originals, but there's also really bad copies. So I think the Turkish psyche has become a little familiar with this, and so when I learned about the history, I was amazed that it wasn't more valued in my own country, and that I didn't see examples of these like everywhere. So I wanted to see what I could do with it in a contemporary way, and I didn't like for that particular reason. I never really have referenced the most traditional, like the most well-known patterns. My interest is more about like bringing what is missing from this, or what I can do that relates to what's going on there right now.
Exactly. Well, there's always politics everywhere, so it's really interesting the kind of part of this sort of neo-Ottoman phase that is kind of playing into it. And Sato, you have a question there.
Yes, I just wanted to also mention that in Kütahya there's been a revival as well, and there are some extremely accomplished modern Turkish potters, studio potters in Kütahya. It's the materials are all there, and it was a slow reconstruction after the First World War, and in fact Kütahya received aid from Germany and Hungary and sent some of the would-be ceramicists to Europe to study. But they've kind of come a long way, and they're producing, like today, really spectacular pieces. So let's not forget Kütahya either.
No, we'll never forget. We all love Kütahya as well as Iznik, of course, and the contemporary. So we it's all completely extraordinary. Now we're going to go. So there's a question for you, Gillian, and this is from Jalal Muhaddisi. And I think what he's talking about is about the limiting of the ceramic art within the borders of Iran. I think what he's asking about is actually was it also, could it go beyond? Are these things that were happening there? Was it just in Tehran? Was it going out into the countryside? And also, how is it influencing ceramic production in the neighboring countries in Pakistan and so on?
Sure. So, I mean, I think the difficult part for me here is that I'm not in a position to make a judgment about what is or is not necessarily in the scope of Iranian ceramics. What I can say is that in the biennial exhibitions, they are very consciously framed as a nationalist art form, using the sort of modernist sense of, the kind of the borders of, the sort of the modern nation state. And I think if you think about the history of what's happening in the sort of early 80s, there's, war between Iran and Iraq. And so I think part of what happens is that there's sort of two strands here. The first one is this kind of unique Iranian Islamic identity, and that the ceramics are sort of consistently intentionally conflated with that sort of identity building process. And then, the other thing is that there's this idea that it's maybe not necessarily the sort of wider region that the intended audience is of these biennials. But for example, all of the catalogs appear in English as well as Farsi, and so they're obviously looking towards you know, an international audience, whether or not that's a you know, a real audience, or whether it's a kind of perceived audience in the kind of sense of building this sense of national identity.
But Jessica, you had a question, I think, for Gillian. Is that right?
Great. Yes, I did. I was absolutely fascinated by your research, and I was in particular wondering if you could sort of elaborate on this connection between the university and sort of this idea of supporting students and giving them a platform, and then the development of the Biennale, sort of this kind of tandem, this relationship that developed between the two institutions in tandem.
Yeah, I think it's a really key idea, this idea that educational institutions play a really starring role in the kind of formation of ceramics development. And I think that's true pretty much universally. I think we can make that claim for studio ceramics in the 20th and 21st centuries, that you know, the universities have the ability to recruit faculty with international experience. They also have the sort of economic wherewithal to, you know, concentrate materials and kilns and technologies, particularly in an era where there is sanctions and the kind of like physical kilns and things that, you know, we might take for granted in a contemporary studio, you know, in Europe or America had limited access. And I think the universities critically also have this kind of, there's a program I talk about in my paper where the sort of Department of Cultural Heritage brings in sort of traditional production potters into the university setting, where they encounter people who are trained in kind of this more sculptural, you know, or the idea of using sort of Iran's ceramic heritage as a kind of language of visual art rather than the forms of it. And so you get this really, you know, interesting hybrid community where people are drawing both from this kind of traditional techniques and the sort of international outlook, as well as the sort of formats of visual arts, which is really productive and exciting.
Thank you so much. Charlotte, I think you had a question for Sato, is that right?
Yes, that's right. Sato, thank you so much for your fascinating paper. I really enjoyed it. I was so interested in the way that Ohanessian managed to, despite being displaced several times, that he actually managed to go on, to carry his practice with him, and to sort of to continue and also reinvent himself. And I think this is something very rare, because very often artists, and I mean, in my paper I also spoke about people being displaced and migrants, but there are many artists who are also being displaced, and especially, I mean, now I'm based in Berlin, and we've just seen over the past years many artists from Syria coming in to the city, and for some it's very easy to find a way to continue to work as professional artists, and for others it's very difficult, and sometimes it can be very arbitrary how they manage, who manages to go on working as artists and who doesn't. And I really found it so fascinating how Ohanessian managed to actually go on, and I wonder if you have some ideas about this.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and I'm also equally fascinated by the artists whose work, you know, you are studying, and so I want to follow up on that after the conference is over and learn more. So he had many displacements. But he had a career in the Ottoman Empire in which he interacted with highly placed government officials, which came in handy later on. And his career extended outside of the Ottoman realm. So, for example, he was commissioned by Mark Sykes to make this kind of very large tiled room for Mark Sykes's Sledmere House in Yorkshire. And a lot of British officials ended up seeing this elaborately tiled room after it was installed in 1914. That played an important role in his future. So he was deported in early 1916. He ended up in Aleppo. After recovering from typhus and various other things, he attempted to start a new ceramics department in the school, in the Imperial School of Arts and Crafts in Aleppo, which led to another deportation, actually. But what happened was, when the British conquered Aleppo at the end of 1918, it was Mark Sykes who went to Aleppo to establish a provisional British government. He found Ohanessian and sent him to Jerusalem, where the new British military administration was searching for a ceramicist who could create renovation tiles for the Dome of the Rock. That was the thing that brought him to Jerusalem. And he worked there for nearly 30 years. In his workshop, he sort of recreated the traditional division of labor with apprentices who were assigned to processing the clay, curing the clay, grinding the glazes, all of this. And Jerusalem at this time, 1918, 1919, for the next few years, took in a huge number of orphaned Armenian refugee children. And one of the things that Ohanessian did was to train them in ceramic making. So his workshop grew and grew. And once he solved the problem of materials, he was able to produce and export a great deal of work. His next stop was Cairo after the violence of 1948, where he did some more work for Prince Muhammad Ali Tawfiq, whose Manial Palace he had tiled back in 1911. So, I mean, he built a web of relationships with royalty, highly placed people, and even like Ottoman government and cultural leaders who surreptitiously helped him at the worst of times. So at the very end of his life, when he was in Beirut, he was in the process of establishing a ceramics department at the American University of Beirut. And he was sitting at the potter's wheel demonstrating. He had a stroke and died a few days later. So he was absolutely persistent, and he wanted to create and he wanted to teach. And I think that kept him alive as long as it did.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's just there's so much to be said, and it's just great to hear from you about all of this. So now we're going to move to a question for you, Jessica. I don't know if you're able to read these questions, but I'm going to read it for you from Louisa, who you know very, very well from all the work that you've done on all the Hazawi material. So the distinction between modernist painters applying painterly motifs to the ceramic medium as distinct from independent modern ceramics practice arose in your paper, and the discussion with Gillian. So are there any instances of the reverse happening, i.e. artists working predominantly in ceramics, applying their motifs and techniques to canvases or to two-dimensional works? Because it was certainly very striking, I thought, when you showed some of the types of work that they were doing, your group, your most recent group, that actually a lot of those designs could also be on canvases as well. So it's that kind of interconnection which is quite interesting. But I think what Louisa meant, was to kind of what Louisa meant, I think, was actually more the artists of the previous generation, I think.
Of the previous generation.
Well, I'm not sure, actually. Let's talk about both. Sorry, I've got confused here.
I mean, I think this is really an excellent question. And I would say, just sort of generally speaking, that the emphasis certainly has been on painting in a number of art schools. And so artists, kind of come to the table with that training. And then, so I'm trying to think of people who started their careers in ceramics who turned to painting, and I'm really not able to think of any. When I consider, for example, the studio of Abdelaziz Gorgi in Tunis in 1959, when he started it, at the School of Fine Arts there, he brought with him an artisan from the city of Nablus to really handle the material of clay and a lot of the technical components. And so I think, you know, what this shows is a real asymmetry in sort of mid-century hierarchies, both in terms of the medium and the material, but also in terms of class, social class. Whereas, you know, I think about Selva de Schuer's work. She was traveling to places in villages in rural Lebanon, working with different ceramicists, you know, who just never had access to the materials of painting. And so with the more contemporary artists, you know, I think they've had a lot more opportunities and platforms for international travel, for collaborations, such as this one, where, you know, artists who train, you know, there were several artists who had been trained in ceramics, and I would, you know, I haven't spoken with some of them personally yet, and I'm hoping to do so, but, you know, it'd be very interesting to see how, you know, how and if they do, you know, go back to the material of painting.
Yeah, I mean, it is so interesting that so many of these artists are actually, they're making ceramics, but they're also painting and making books and all of that. And so Gillian, I wanted to ask you that question as well, which is that those artists who, you know, are in the ceramic biennales, to what extent are some of them also, you know, when they're not making ceramics, you know, they're making they're making paintings, or they're making video art, or whatever. Are they at home making subversive art? You know, I mean, what is the scene there?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would echo everything that Jessica just said, particularly about the previous generation, in that I think modernist artists are more comfortable borrowing the kind of the idiom of historic ceramics and applying it into sort of painting or sculpture, whereas kind of contemporary artists, particularly I'm thinking Maryam Salour is an example of an Iranian artist who is kind of working back and forth between the two mediums and allowing her ceramics to really influence her painting practice. As far as kind of mid-century, I think Marcos Gregorian is an example of someone who's physically using clay on the canvas as a kind of reference to, you know, the sort of architecture of his, you know, home village, you know, sort of culture. But you know, I think there's a really clear distinction between the kind of investment in time and materials that it takes to master ceramics, whereas we don't really expect painters to kind of grind their own paints and make their own, you know, weave their own canvases in order to produce something authentic. But for ceramics, that's a significant investment in time and materials to be able to, you know, to produce that. And so I think while there is definitely a distinct borrowing from fine arts traditions that appears in ceramics in the context of Iran, particularly in the sort of ability of the biennial artists to reference their own history in the kind of the medium that they're working in. I think it goes both ways, but it's less apparent because we kind of take it for granted that those things will appear in ceramics.
Yeah, and it's also non-controversial as well. What they're doing, you can be much more abstract. I mean, unless you're, you know, doing what Elif does, which is actually, you know, talking about kind of quite hard-hitting issues there as well. So there's a kind of quite interesting contrast, really, there. Elif, I don't know whether you have some, you know, you can comment on some of these. So what we saw with the works, these Iranian artists with in the Tehran biennials. No?
I mean, yeah, I can like just also personally say that I do. I mean, I do go back and forth between painting and ceramics, and I, you know, do. I mean, it is the traditional motifs. After I started working with the ceramics, started appearing more in my paintings in terms of like border patterns and you know, ornamentation. So I mean, I think it's you know, it's also like speaks to the hierarchy issues in fine art, that, like, you know, ceramics was, you know, not considered fine arts until you know, until very recently. Now it's everywhere. But you know, that's why I was in the beginning, I was adamant about showing both mediums together in the same exhibitions, or even on the same walls, like, you know, next to one another, just to establish that, you know, clay is just as you know, significant and you know, legitimate as an art form as painting.
Sato, please come in.
Just a quick thing about the, you know, considering ceramics fine art and when that started. That one of my grandfather's partners in Kütahya in the early 20th century was Mehmet Emin, who consistently from the end of the 19th century into the early 20th signed his works. I mean, his self-conceptualization was as an artist, and even in my grandfather's practice, apart from the tile works, which he generally signed, there was a distinction between like market wares, which were produced in quantity and using the technique that Elif mentioned, so the stencils with the charcoal dust, and the works that we would now call studio pottery, which were like original forms thrown on the wheel with maybe incised or molded in an unusual way, individually painted, signed. So I think whether it was considered by the larger world as a fine art or not, the artists themselves considered themselves to be artists and made unique pieces in addition to the pieces that they made for the market to sustain the economy of their studios.
So I'm just going to take one, thank you for that. I'm just going to take one more. Am I allowed to take one more question, or we're now into Oya's screen now? So was that, yes, one more, okay. So actually the question, it was a question from Mariam, and it was referring back to Raed Yassin about kind of, was he ever tempted to break the vases, and I was reminded actually with this whole thing with Raed Yassin is that there was a huge controversy between him and Ai Weiwei, which you might be able to comment on. So the thing is that Raed Yassin was apparently one of the things that influenced him when he was coming up with that project, was seeing how Ai Weiwei dropped the ceramic vase. And then there's been this whole controversy because Raed Yassin thinks that Ai Weiwei, in his recent series of ceramics, he's having pictures of migrants and all that, is actually inspired by him, or indeed copying him. And I just thought that would be quite an interesting thing, Charlotte. That's going to be our last question, but about this whole thing of breaking the pots and your views on this controversy, which is so interesting.
Yes, it's a very good point, really. I don't think Raed ever thought of really breaking the vases. They are there as a kind of suggestion that you might do it with them, or you might just let them stand around and hope for a child or a dog or somebody else break them. I don't think he ever considered taking this action of actually breaking one of the vases. And now, of course, I mean, maybe it could be interesting actually to do it now, simply as a kind of reaction, sort of to retake the original work, because, I mean, of course, contemporary artists are always in a perpetual dialogue, and a lot of art relies on a dialogue between artists and their work. So it's always a bit difficult to say who's copying who, or when does an artist reference, when does an artist react. But I do think that Ai Weiwei's vases do seem very close to Raed Yassin's work, and Raed's work was before. So it has been discussed a lot.
Yeah.
I don't know, as I said, maybe it would be interesting now for Raed to take back the action and actually go and break one of his vases.
Or actually to have the works exhibited alongside each other. I think that would be also very, very
also
interesting. Yeah, well, we've come to an end of this wonderful session. I want to thank you, speakers, so much for your incredible presentations. There's really such richness there, and you've taken us in lots of very, very interesting directions. And for this wonderful conversation that we've had just now, I've enjoyed it so much. And thank you very much to the audience for being there and for asking those really very perceptive questions. So we're closing this panel, and it's my utter privilege now to be introducing the wonderful Oya Panjarolu, our colleague and great friend, who's going to make the closing remarks for this wonderful and inspiring conference. Now, she'll be well known to all of you, I know, and she has an extraordinary list of publications. She's worked a lot on ceramics and tiles. Some of you will know her book Perpetual Glory, Medieval Ceramics, from the Plotnik collection from 2007. She's done really important work on figural representation and so on in the Blackwell's volume there, and has worked in so many different and really interesting ways. So Oya, it's a privilege really to be introducing you. It's wonderful to see you, and thank you. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. And I'm assuming you can hear me, yeah? Okay, I'd like to, of course, begin just like everybody else, thanking the organizers, Miriam Rosser-Owen and Leslie Mickelson, for putting together this really massive initiative, and to everyone working behind the scenes as well to make it such a great success. As far as I've been able to determine, and please correct me if I'm wrong, the last time an academic meeting on a somewhat broad range of ceramics from the Islamic world took place, and that was all the way back in 1974. So it has been a long time coming, indeed. Now, I've been searching in vain for the last several days for a program of that symposium that was organized at the Freer Gallery of Art in 1973-74 in Washington, D.C. I have not yet succeeded in finding the program, but I do know that the program, the symposium was held in conjunction with an exhibition that the late Esin Atıl organized, and for which she also authored the catalog that you see on the screen as well. Now, even if I could procure a copy of that symposium program, it wouldn't be right to compare that initiative with this one for all sorts of reasons. Nevertheless, I find the nearly 50-year gap between that symposium and this conference quite hard to believe. So this conference has been truly inclusive, of course, not exhaustive, not really possible in 8 sessions, but I think it has succeeded in giving everyone a sense of what inclusivity can potentially be. The scope of the program is really awe-inspiring, not only in the number of papers, and there have been 40 papers plus 1 keynote lecture, but also in the breadth of periods, regions, subjects, and methodologies that have been included in them. Many issues have been raised, too many, of course, to be adequately summarized by yours truly in 30 minutes. So, having been charged with the mission to provide some kind of reflective summary on the proceedings, I must admit that I am not only humbled, but also somewhat dazed. From the outset, I would like to state that I will be content if I can do even partial justice to these proceedings and provide some kind of a rational wrap-up. So given not only the vast scope of the conference, but also the limited time in which to wrap up, let me dive in without further ado. I will start by reflecting on the shape of the field, and then I will attempt to pick up some of the threads that I noticed running across the papers and sessions. And also, I think that just very briefly, the format within which this conference has unfolded also needs to be acknowledged at the outset. The pandemic has necessitated many new ways of doing things, and conferencing has been no exception. Had this conference been held pre-pandemic, it would no doubt have been enriching in different, more social ways. But I, for one, would have missed out on quite a bit of the very substance of these papers, for the simple human reason that listening to live academic papers for hours on end is just really exhausting. Having the papers pre-recorded, on the other hand, allowed us to partake of them at our own pace, and therefore to understand them better. And those recordings are available for another 2 weeks, giving us ample opportunity to revisit them after the discussions of this week. So I mentioned, of course, in the beginning that such a conference has been long overdue. No large-scale gathering of scholars in this field has been organized since that 1974 symposium in the Freer Gallery of Art. I hope the energy that we have witnessed here will convince us that ceramics from Islamic lands is a major field of study that deserves a regular organization of such academic meetings. So I will just plant that seed here in these remarks and hope that it will germinate in the form of a regular organization of conferences held every few years on the study of ceramics from Islamic lands. And having now attended the entirety of this conference, it seems evident that we have nevertheless come rather far in the study of ceramics from Islamic lands. But can we measure how far we have come? To get even a simple sense of the distance of achievement, we need a benchmark of some sort, a kind of a useful starting point. If we can't look back to a set of conferences, what can we look back to? How can we gauge how far we have come with this conference? The easy answer is to look at publications. And indeed, a lot of publications on ceramics have been put out in the last 100 years or more. Not to worry, I will not enumerate them all today, although a historiographic evaluation of this field is also long overdue, which has been highlighted in a number of the papers. What I want to propose here is rather a simple, perhaps even somewhat crude morphology of publications, which I envision as an uneven landscape of 3 major zones, but one that I hope helps us to think about the cumulative shape of the field. Now, so this is how I kind of wanted to visualize it. It helped me to think about it. The 3 zones, this landscape of 3 zones, I've picked an image from the Mongolian steppe because I thought it kind of did a nice kind of juxtaposition of different features. And in the foreground there, we have publications in the field of archaeology and archaeometry. Perhaps the 2 should be separate. I've kind of, for the sake of simplicity, I've put them together. Now, in the recent decades, we've witnessed the growing promise of archaeological and archaeometric studies of ceramics. And this has been amply demonstrated in this conference. And publications in this zone are, for the most part, in the form of reports with an ever-expanding coverage of periods and geographies. And these constitute scientific reports that basically build upon each other. There is, it seems, an exponential rise in the volume of available data coming out of these studies. But do we, I mean, by we, I mean all of us, have roadmaps for dealing with this data? How can we work towards integrating this data to non-archaeometric studies of ceramics, most especially, for example, to art historical studies? So that question brings me to the second zone that I've labeled there in the middle ground as art historical essays and monographs. There has always been a steady trickle, maybe more than a trickle at times, of art historical essays and books concerned largely with formal aspects of ceramic decoration, and some effort has gone towards defining typologies as well as considering the artistic endeavor within its cultural and social context. In the current state of research, however, this zone of the landscape is possibly losing some ground, or at least it may not be keeping pace with the two other zones. Perhaps this is also a debatable observation, but as an art historian myself, I feel that this part of the landscape needs more and better cultivation. And if it can be cultivated more and better, I hope that it can expand and modify the ways in which contextualization is perceived in the zone of archaeology and archaeometry, expanding the idea of context, for example, beyond physical location, stratigraphy, or trade networks. And in the distance, but looming very, very large, are catalogs. The catalogs are the heavyweight, the great mountain of this three-zone landscape of publications. It is catalogs that dominate the bookshelves of anyone interested, professionally or otherwise, in the field of ceramics from Islamic lands. These consist of museum catalogs, private collection catalogs, exhibition catalogs, gallery catalogs, you name it, there is a catalog. There are catalogs that take us back to the 19th century, maybe even earlier. Perhaps catalogs are utilized, and in fact they are not only utilized, but they are produced more by art historians, more so than by, let's say, archaeologists or material scientists, mainly because many or even most of the catalogs present objects that are detached from any hard evidence of original contexts, objects that are deemed to be of little or no value to an archaeological or archaeometric study. I may be wrong in this, but I suspect and see that there is a boundary within the field, within the landscape, that is a challenge, and an awkward challenge at that. And the prospect of crossing it from either side may feel like a transgression of sorts, psychologically speaking, of course. On the other hand, this conference has taken the very first and difficult step of initiating a platform for conversation. And I think it behooves us, archaeologists, art historians, and material scientists, to make sure that the conversation continues and progresses to a point where the three zones marking the landscape of publications begin to merge into one another. I mean a partial merging rather than a total one, which I don't think would be feasible or even desirable. One might argue that there's also a fourth part to this landscape in the form of publications produced by the art market, especially by the auction houses. These are also usually catalogs, of course, but I would not automatically include them as a natural or rightful component of the landscape of academic publications. The subject of the art market certainly impacts the whole field, but it is a can of worms beyond the scope of these closing remarks. It should also be said that there are and there will be publications that may not fit into this neat categorization that I've put out here. And there are indeed significant cases of overlap that we can cite. There are, for example, some archaeological reports that read like catalogs, which may be a positive or a negative thing, depending what you think of a catalog is. Also, there are catalogs that have essayistic tendencies and employ meaningful methodologies. Or there are catalogs that incorporate or are even motivated by either or both art historical and scientific analyses. And this kind of list of overlaps can go on. Largely absent from this landscape are monographs that offer meaningfully comprehensive surveys transcending typological, chronological, or geographic boundaries, and also articulating key questions, problems, and directions for the future. There is, in other words, a general lack of authoritative guides to the field, with the remarkable but hardly recent exception of Arthur Lane's 2 volumes in the Faber ceramic series from the mid-20th century, which Venetia remarked on in the last session about having consulted for a topic recently. And I will return to Arthur Lane at the end of these remarks. We might argue that some of these catalogs are so extensive in their coverage that they virtually fill this gap. But it must be admitted that catalogs of collections and museums have built-in biases by definition, for the sheer reason that they are particular and peculiar collections, each with its own emphasis and gaps. So putting aside some of the more substantial catalogs, such as they are, the fact remains that there is still no Oxford Handbook on Ceramics from Islamic Lands, or a Cambridge Companion to Ceramics from Islamic Lands. Perhaps this is just as well for the time being, because I think this conference has really shown us how broadly the field can potentially be defined. Having witnessed this breadth, I propose that we need to dwell more on flexible and inclusive, but also workable definitions for the field before launching on such a handbook companion publication project. Now, if we begin by considering some of the main themes and threads running across these papers, some of which or many of which at first glance seem to have nothing to do with each other, then we may be able to define workable as well as adaptable and sustainable tracks of common inquiry. Perhaps this is wishful thinking on my part, but perhaps not. So let me then turn to the threads that I have picked up across the 8 pre-recorded and 8 live sessions plus 1 keynote lecture of this conference. I see this as a kind of a preliminary exercise in cross-referencing the conference papers. My apologies in advance for not being able to refer to each of the papers individually. So I haven't really ordered these threads in any kind of priority, but one thread that I've seen, and I guess they're all obvious, this one is obvious certainly, is this kind of geographic and temporal diffusion. Now we have seen material from truly unexplored territory from the perspective of the conventional study of Islamic ceramics. So we've seen, for example, a paper on material from the Emirate of Crete, which I had never kind of come across in any publications, or on medieval Maldives, or papers on Eastern Ethiopia, on Central Oman, on North Java. As well, in the last 2 panels today, the live sessions, we've had discussions on modern and contemporary ceramics, which are typically not included in this kind of conventional approach. So that's been fascinating, and many of these papers challenged the concept of peripheral versus central, whether in time or place. Especially this is evident with places like Crete or Maldives, because they are, in fact, for example, those 2 examples, physically so central and yet have been neglected until now. Likewise, the modern and contemporary topics are at the far end of the time spectrum, and yet they pull and push on the traditions, whether through things like diplomatic gifting, museum acquisitions, museum categorizations, exhibitions, commodification, etc. Now, a second thread I would propose that I find running across the papers is that of chronology. And this is, of course, a really kind of a high frequency theme. Many of us have to deal with this, and it's a seemingly straightforward one. It is straightforward in many cases. Can be a matter of analyzing materials, of analyzing stratigraphy or epigraphy to come up with chronology, but it is also rather convoluted in other ways. There are cases where we see time folding back on itself in the ceramic industry. There is almost a kind of a ceramic time as opposed to conventional time. So we've noticed this in the keynote lecture, the idea which introduced us to the idea of recycling between the Safavid and the Qajar period, kind of bringing those two time periods into one. And we've also seen examples of where ceramics as a kind of an innovative and changing medium, but one that can also be at times deliberately conservative and somewhat deviously imitative. And we've seen, for example, Kate Franklin talked about these red slipped wares from Bajazor that hark back to antiquity from the medieval period. Or Michaela Sinibaldi's paper where she talked about the challenge of and rewards of analyzing extremely conservative handmade pottery tradition at Petra. We've seen the terracotta spires in Kashmir with visual links to a Buddhist and Hindu past, or Bernard O'Kane's paper where he demonstrated the application of these unusual horizontal bands of tile work in Punjab, which he linked to Hindu temple architecture of the past. Now, a third thread I would say is recovery and construction. And this is really kind of, again, very obvious one. We've had papers from Stephanie Mulder, who discussed the situation and the necessity of bringing this material together despite everything that has happened. But we've seen kind of recovery and reconstruction in other contexts in Iran. For example, the recovery of the Kashan kiln by Abbas Akbari, the search for the tiles of the Pir Bakran by Anna Maria Gerbanovic, likewise the tiles of the Chinili Hammam in Istanbul by Tim Stanley and Charlotte Mohi, or Robert Mason's paper on trying to reconstruct 17th century tile panels from Isfahan. We could also add to this list Paul Wordsworth's paper on Akhand wares, where he put together an interesting case of recovery via not only archaeology, but historiography as well. Lastly, I want to discuss the very obvious one of the craft or the art. It's a question of how did they make it? Now, all of the material science papers, of course, especially in the first, third, and fifth panels, belong to this kind of thread, and there are too many to name them individually. The material science of ceramics was supplemented and really meaningfully expanded, I thought, by two papers, one yesterday and one just in this very last session, that gave us biographies of ceramic artists who straddled tradition and modernity. Atif Said Musavi presented on the Shirazi ceramic artist Mirza Abdurrazak Faghpuri and Sato Mughalian on David Ohanessian in Jerusalem. So these two papers especially, at least from my perspective, kind of help to recall the human dimension of art history as well as of material science. And I think they allowed us to understand the brilliance of tile work as a both traditional and also an ever-evolving art, both with deep roots, but also with great promise of design and technology. So this is just a few of the many threads that I thought were running across these sessions. One could, of course, come up with other threads, trade, networks, technology transfers, etc. Again, in the limited time, I won't be able to go into all of that. I hope, of course, that we will have future opportunities to revisit collectively and individually these threads and more, whether in future large conferences such as this one, or smaller symposia, or even workshops, for which I think there is also a definite need. Now, since this conference has been hosted so successfully by the V&A, I did not want to end these remarks without paying homage to Arthur Lane. Arthur Lane, most of you will know, was the author of the 2 volumes published in the mid-20th century, which are to date the only handbooks of ceramics from the Islamic lands, with a remit to be fairly comprehensive, at least by the standards of the mid-20th century. Arthur Lane was also the keeper of the Department of Ceramics at the V&A between 1950 and 1963. His career at the V&A began in 1934 when he was appointed as assistant keeper in the same department. So his tenure lasted almost 30 years, during which time he published more than a fair amount on ceramics, contributing a good number of volumes to the Faber monograph series on pottery and porcelain that was launched in 1947, not to mention a great many articles as well as booklets. Lane's academic training had actually been in classical studies at Cambridge, and subsequently in 1932, he became a fellow in the British School in Athens. 5 years later, however, in 1937, his participation in the excavation of the port of Elmina, then in French Mandate Syria, under the direction of Leonard Woolley, introduced him to Islamic ceramics, a subject on which he studied and published regularly throughout the rest of his life. His first contribution to the Faber monograph series was the 1947 volume on early Islamic pottery. It was subtitled Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Persia. Incidentally, it was one of the very first volumes in the series. So thanks to Arthur Lane, actually, Islamic pottery got a real head start in this series. 10 years later, in 1957, he published the sequel, Later Islamic Pottery. And that one was subtitled Persia, Syria, Egypt, Turkey. To date, these two volumes together remain as a major milestone in the attempt to synthesize a broad understanding of the ceramic output of the Central Islamic lands from the 8th to the 19th century, without being limited by the holdings of a single collection or to the output of a particular region or period. What makes these volumes remarkable, not only for to the ceramics, linking objects to decisive observations, narrative. Throughout both volumes, there is ample and palpable sense of the balance he achieved between his proficiency as a museum curator and his early scholarly engagement with archaeology as a participant of the Elmina excavations and the subsequent production of related archaeological reports. He was trained neither as an art historian nor an archaeologist, but he embraced and combined both perspectives admirably and intelligently. In this respect, I think Arthur Lane would have been keenly appreciative of the spirit and substance of this conference. It's been a long time coming, and it now stands as a milestone in the ever-evolving study of ceramics from the Islamic lands. So thank you once again to the organizers, to everyone in the V&A who worked to make it a reality, and to my fellow participants and everyone from around the globe who tuned in the last few days. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Oya, for undertaking the difficult task of reflecting on the issues raised this week by all the papers we've heard and the conference as a whole. And I look forward to all of us jointly discussing some of the next steps and ways forward that you suggested. I can't believe how quickly this week has passed and that it's already time for me to wish you all goodbye. It seems like only yesterday that I was welcoming you to our keynote lecture. So it falls to me on behalf of Leslie and myself to give huge thanks to all of our brilliant speakers and moderators for the really rich discussions we have had this week. Even though we haven't been able to come together in person, I think the digital format has worked really well. We've had some proper and really interesting discussions across multiple time zones and international borders. I've loved immersing myself in all things ceramic this week, and I've also learnt so much. I've also been really happy to see the conversations and information sharing and new collaborations that have been generated by this group of speakers, by bringing this group of speakers together, and I hope that these conversations will continue and will develop. We were amazed by the enormous interest in this conference, and I want to thank all the attendees as well, who've asked such great questions and posted comments throughout the week. We would love your feedback, so please do get in touch to let us know what you thought of the conference. And we're going to post the email address in the chat box in a second. Huge thanks again to my colleagues in the V&A's AV team, especially Oliver Orwell, who's been in the background all week, for making sure that everyone was able to connect safely to their panel sessions. And thanks too to the gods of the internet for keeping most of our Wi-Fi connections stable while we were live. There have been a few moments when we started to wonder what our backup plan was going to be, but hopefully it's all looked seamless from your side of the screen. We've recorded this week's panel discussions and we will make these available on the V&A website as soon as we can organise that. And we'll send out a link to everyone who's registered for the conference when these are ready to view. A final reminder to everyone that all of our speakers' pre-recorded papers are still accessible to view on Vimeo for another 2 weeks after today, until the 6th of August, so you still have time to catch them up or watch them all again. And on that note, thank you so much for joining us this week and enjoy your weekend.